There's a statistic that makes a lot of people very, very uncomfortable. Black marriage rates in America were significantly higher during segregation than they are today. At a time when racism was far more open, discrimination was legal, and opportunities were more restricted. But marriage rates were stronger. Two-parent households were more common, and family stability was statistically higher than what we see now. So here's the question. If racism alone explains modern Black struggle, then why were some social outcomes stronger during periods of more obvious racism? Human beings love simple explanations, especially emotional explanations, because simple narratives reduce complexity. They help us organize the world into causes, villains, victims, and solutions. But every once in a while, a statistic appears that complicates the story. And many people instinctively avoid it. Old census records and marriage statistics, according to historical data, Black marriage rates in the United States remained remarkably high throughout much of the early and mid 20th century, including periods of segregation and Jim Crow, open discrimination, and limited legal rights. Now, that does not mean racism was unimportant. It absolutely mattered. But it does force us to ask, are there any other variables that are influencing community outcomes beyond racism alone? So what happened? Why did marriage rates decline? Why did fatherlessness rise? Why did family fragmentation increase? And perhaps more importantly, why are these questions often treated as dangerous? Some people point to economics. Others point to things like mass incarceration. Still others point to things like welfare policy. And still others point to cultural shifts. Some people point to media influence. The reality is probably all of the above, because social decline is rarely caused by one thing. One of the most controversial discussions involves welfare expansion in the 1960s and 70s. Critics argue that certain policies unintentionally created incentives that serve to weaken the family structure. In some cases, financial assistance became easier to receive if a father was absent from the household. And over time, incentives tend to shape behavior. Now, does this mean that welfare caused every social problem? Of course not. But refusing to examine incentives honestly makes meaningful understanding impossible. Economics matter, policy matters, but culture matters too. Communities are shaped by what they reward, what they normalize, and what they celebrate. There was once enormous social pressure toward marriage, discipline, responsibility, church involvement, and long term family structure. Not perfection, but expectation. And when expectations collapse, outcomes often follow. So, why do conversations like this create so much tension? Because they threaten emotionally protected narratives. If every problem can be explained externally, then internal examination becomes unnecessary. And internal examination is painful because it introduces things like responsibility, accountability, agency, and a host of difficult choices. Human beings prefer explanations that preserve emotional comfort. But societies that lose the ability to self reflect often lose the ability to self correct. Maybe the deeper issue here is not simply marriage, Maybe it's what happens when communities stop asking difficult questions. Every society creates narratives about itself, some empowering, some destructive, some incomplete. But growth becomes difficult when complexity is treated like betrayal. And perhaps that's why certain statistics feel dangerous, because they force us to examine not just oppression, but behavior. The point of this conversation is not to romanticize segregation. Segregation was real, racism was real, injustice was real. But if some social structures were stronger during that period, shouldn't we at least be willing to ask why? Honest conversations require emotional maturity, because mature thinking demands complexity, and complexity rarely ever fits into slogans. So let me ask you, do you think modern society still encourages strong family structure? Or does it slowly undermine it? Let me know what you think.